Hey guys, what's up? Been a while since I've worn this hat, huh? Because it's floppy. That's usually why I don't wear it. But anyway, um, new video, martial arts related. Yay. Thought I was gonna do one more serious, but I just kind of lost track of that one, and I apologize for it. But I will get like a political one up soon or something like that. Anyway, because I'm overdue for that. Ugh. Recently, I every now and then I check my YouTube notifications, and I know I am horrible with answering some people sometimes with some questions. Sometimes I see a question and I'm able to answer it right away, and other times I'll see a question but I'm in the middle of work or something, like, okay, I'll get to that later, and then I forget about it, and it's like a week or a couple of weeks later, and I'm like, oh, it's not that like I'm trying to ignore you guys. Sometimes I just miss them, or sometimes it just goes past my head, and then by then I realize it's way too late to answer it. I'm really sorry, but every now and then I get to actually pay attention and actually notice some, comments going up. And one happened under one of my older videos from a while back, basically under whether you were able to learn martial arts from books or not. And you can go to that video to check out my opinion there. And then the subsequent video that got built from that, most people took the video as constructive, though there was at least one or two people, one guy in particular, who was really offended by that and went on to state that all this stuff about HEMA is a major waste of time. Like, he really was focusing on HEMA and how it's illegitimate, it doesn't compare to traditional sword arts and things like that. Now, that was a debate that I got into a little bit and then just let go, because a long time ago, it's like over 2 years ago at this point, and I didn't care. I said what I had to say in the matter, and then I made another video on that, the whole thing, and I left it alone. My phone, sorry. But then recently, like way after, like I said, 2 years ago, video's old, but then recently somebody actually engaged the person who had a problem with the idea that manuals and books are things that could be useful to somebody who wanted to learn this stuff. Basically, basically saying that, well, what's the difference between, I'm getting this from memory and I could get it wrong, but it was like, what's the difference between what you guys are doing, what the HEMA guys are doing? Like, they're learning from books and treatises, and you guys are learning from books and treatises, so what is the problem? And the guy basically answered back with something akin to the fact that, well, you guys are just making shit up when we're not. And the other person, rightfully pointed out that, well, basically, we're basically doing the same thing. But it got me thinking. I mean, I could do a whole video on the fact that traditionalists are deluding themselves when they think that their arts are coming from this unbroken line where they're not doing any interpretations of movements of their techniques at all. It's just completely unchanging. But I already did a video on that. You can check it out later, if you want. But it got me thinking, what is the difference between interpretation and making things up? Well, a person has a problem with interpretation, period, but if they do, then they should quit martial arts altogether, because if you are learning a traditional art, and that means you're using techniques that have not been used on the battlefield in at least centuries, depending on what art you're training in, there is going to be interpretation. Unless you're going to tell me right now that somebody with a katana is out there fighting against another katana user in the middle of a battlefield somewhere, surrounded by a whole bunch of other guys with similar arms, dressed in armor, unless you're telling me that's happening right now in a life or death situation, you're interpreting your shit. And you're deluding yourself if you think you're not. But it still makes me wonder. Well, it made me ponder for a little bit. Like, what is the difference between just making things up and actually interpreting something that was already written down and researched? Like when you're looking through manuals and such. Now, I could be an ass and just simply point out that technically you're always making things up. I mean, things don't just simply come out of a vacuum. Like martial arts didn't pop up ex nihilo. You know, it is people had to make this stuff up from somewhere. Now, granted, it as years went on, it built on knowledge, built on knowledge. Like you didn't just simply, oh, I'm just going to make up some attack and it's instantly going to work. No, it's okay. Here's a basic human instinct of swinging a stick, and they transfer it to a sword or an axe or whatever weapon they're using. And it's like, okay, well, this person generally attacks this way. I could, maybe if I attack this way, I can stop it. Maybe if I put up my arm this way, I can defend myself. And people kept on coming up with different ways of coming up with these techniques, and they did make it up. The people made up or thought up of ideas and then practiced them, put them in, saw if they worked, and if they didn't work, they tossed it aside, and if it did work, then they kept it, and it became part of their style, their art, and we built upon that information. And now we've gotten to the point with these martial arts where we no longer feel the need to make anything up on top of that, because it's like the stuff's already fully researched. You just copy this and train in it, and you can do it. You might put your own spin on it, but for more or less, you do it this way because we've already got this long body of knowledge to go on. So if I wanted to be an ass, I could just answer that way and end the video. There we go. You're always making stuff up. Shut up. But no. Let me not be a jerk. Generally, when the term is being used, if you're just making things up, it's just more like, just somebody with absolutely no clue what the hell they're doing, just pulling something out of their ass, like just straight up make-believe. I come up with some invincible moon-slicing circular slash, and that's now part of the art, with no testing whatsoever. So, yeah, what's the difference between that and interpreting what's in old manuals and then trying to reconstruct them? There's plenty. That is the difference between the two. And it takes an incredible amount of blindness or straight up arrogance not to see the difference between what people in HEMA or, in other organizations of Western martial arts do and what somebody just making stuff up does. Like, to really not see what modern interpretations of martial arts are. Like, the people who put in that research, to look at that and say, oh, they're just making stuff up, shows a gross ignorance of what's really going on. Not to mention an amazing amount of arrogance in one's own training. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the HEMA guys are more realistic than the traditionalists, and I'll get into that in a moment, even though I think I already went into it in my video, but I'll put it at the end here. Generally, when people are looking at these old manuals, they recognize right off the bat that, okay, we're not in war times anymore, and there's really nobody walking around who really... Well, at the time when they're starting this, it's like there's no real old master up in the hill somewhere who still trains in these weapons. Like, the line has been broken. But we are interested in these arts, and we'd like to find some way to resurrect them. So what do? This is not... What HEMA's doing, it's not the first freaking time that this has come up. As I've stated many times before, martial arts all around the world has had a history of broken lineages where styles were lost. And then later on somebody kind of stumbles across it or hears about it or gets their hands on the main techniques, and then they're like, how do I bring this back? Because there's no one else around that really knows how to do this stuff. But this stuff is useful, and I would like to bring it back to the forefront. This is going to take some research and reinterpretation. And that means part of it is, one, at least understanding the language and the context that these arts were written in and developed in. Like, okay, first of all, you got to be able to read the freaking treatises, which means knowing the language. You need to know something of the culture that was dominant at the time that these things came from, because that helps to give you context. You also need to understand the general rules of combat as people observe them at that time to also kind of give you context. And the more you know about that past period of time and the theories that, people held to at the time, the combat theories, the better of a chance you'll be able to figure out what it is that these treatises are trying to convey. It also helps that the treatises were well written to begin with. The more, the better written they are, the more you can get out of them. Same thing with the artwork. The clearer the artwork and the diagrams are, the better it'll be for you to figure out what it is that they're trying to do. I mean, if you just see one static image like this is special technique. It could be anything. It could be a guy getting ready to thrust. It could be a guy preparing to block. It could be a guy shifting into position. You don't know. And if there's nothing to explain the drawing well, you're fucked, right? So, and unfortunately, this happens, especially with Eastern traditions. You see a lot of that with these manuals that don't really give much, at least the old ones. Not much to go on. So what do? Besides trying to figure out the context of things in the past? Well, you are going to have to put some modern interpretation into there. Now, it just so happens that since human beings love being jerks to one another, we're still fighting to this day. And certain basic combat rules and certain ideas of combat haven't really changed all that much. So you can take that modern understanding and look back on the past stuff and more or less be able to figure things out. More or less. Some things are going to get lost in translation. You can't help that. You can't, say that you will be able to get something that was lost in the past 100%. That's insane. But you can get close. And sometimes our modern ideas actually kind of came from stuff in the past that we may have forgotten about, but sort of still clinged to in a different way. Like maybe this certain spear technique, we may have forgotten the use of that spear, but it transferred to our bayonet use. See what I mean? Or like the way we used to handle, using a knife back then kind of transferred to how we use knives these days, or like certain sticks these days, or whatever. Like things do evolve and move on, and sometimes you can kind of reverse engineer what we do now to kind of figure out what they did then. Just to give you one example. These are some of the things that people in HEMA and other groups do when they look at these treatises. They look at what was written back then, how people fought back then, and try to reconstruct from that. But they also think of their modern ideas of how to fight. And then they go out and they try to make it work. See, that's the other thing that's important. Trying to make it work. It's one thing to just simply come up with shit, but you then have to apply it and see if it can be applied. And if it can, and you can do it consistently, and you can actually do it in a way that actually it's viable, in terms of combat and with the tools you're using, then hey, it works. What's the problem? Can you 100% say that this is exactly how the Grandmasters did it? Maybe not. But does it work? Yeah. You'll be able to survive with it, with a longsword. Like, since I keep talking about the HEMA thing, let's just say you find these longsword techniques and you're able to reinterpret it and you actually turn it into an art that looks at least 85 to 90% similar to what was done back then. What's the problem? Especially since, again, martial arts have been doing this for centuries, reinterpreting themselves. Pigwajang, Tongbei, Xingyi, these are Chinese arts that have been rebuilt at least once or twice throughout their lifespans. Japanese sword arts, forget it. Those have been reconstructed since the Meiji era and beforehand. Anybody practicing a Japanese sword art who's like, this is special unbroken line. Bullshit. And I'll just simply, again, point it as practically as I can. The very fact that no one's using this on the battlefield anymore should automatically make you suspicious of anybody who tells you that this is being done exactly the same way as before. Because you don't know that. You haven't tested it in a life or death experience, and you don't have groups of people doing it that way to verify that this stuff is being done the exact same way as before. Now, one last thing, which I don't know if I said this in the video because it was a long time ago, but if I did, I apologize for repeating it now. I honestly feel that when it comes to the whole making things up versus interpretation and, you're interpreting and that's garbage. The people who are in HEMA or in other, like ARMA or other Western martial arts stuff, I honestly feel are more realistic and practical minded and full of less bullshit than the hardcore traditionalists. And the reason why is because they are not lying to themselves. Especially when you talk to, when I say a traditionalist, I'm not necessarily saying the people in Japan, but more the guys in the West who then completely start worshiping this stuff, and then you end up with the people who end up in the comment section under videos like that. Those who are obsessed with Koryu and the like, who are always like, traditional line, and they're constantly dressing up in Japanese clothing and all that type of stuff. They worship this idea that what they're doing is unadulterated and unbroken, and we're doing it exactly the same way. And it's just not true. Just a cursory look at the history and development of your art outside of whatever your teacher is telling you. Because I hate to tell you this, most of the people out there who are teaching you this stuff aren't historians. They're just telling you what's been told to them, and they're telling you in a certain way to sell how great their art is. But just looking at the country's history, you know, you can't just simply look at what your person tells you is the history of your art. You got to research it. Just the history of your country alone will tell you that doesn't make any sense. How can it be unbroken when there weren't any samurai for how knows how long? When it was outlawed to even carry a sword after a certain period of time. And then, and then talking about, they brought it back as kendo. And then they took all these different sword arts and like took the best techniques out of that and then came up with a new modern form. Like, you see, like, there's actually written down their textbooks on this stuff. Okay? Reinterpretations of old stuff. Will you find some old school somewhere that is like, well, this old village, no one messed with them, they're still doing it the same way? Yeah, you probably will. And I can even probably come up with a couple of examples. I got a list in my file somewhere of different old schools. But these old schools are just practicing their stuff in their dojos in a nice patio somewhere without spilling any blood. That's going to change your art, whether you want to admit it or not. It's going to change the flavor of it. There's nothing you can do about it. But you're going to keep on lying to yourself saying that, oh, we're doing it the same way. Spirit of the samurai is in us. Okay. While you're believing in that fairy tale, you then have these modern guys who are going, okay, we got these old books, old manuals, and sorry, phone again. We got these old manuals and stuff, and we got nobody really around who knows exactly how this was done. No more sword masters. But we do have a background in some martial arts, so we got an idea of how to fight. You fenced once, right? Yeah, I used to do a little bit of fencing. Or you know, like, I messed with a katana of it. I know how to. So we got an idea of how to use swords. You know how to read, right? Of course we do. You know how to study. We've researched stuff, old stuff. We can find some little archaeologist somewhere. Let's really study this and see if we can really make this work. Oh, and by the way, when you are interpreting something, I should have said this earlier, you're not making things up. You're coming up with your best conclusion with what you are faced with. You are interpreting what's in front of you and trying to come up with the best, you're trying to come up with the closest idea you possibly can from what you've just read. Some interpretations are off. Many are pretty close. Sometimes you can be spot on. But it's not something that you're just making up out of nowhere. It's not something you just pull out of your ass. If you're pulling something out of your ass, it's a horrible interpretation. That's why there are such things as good interpretations and bad interpretations. They take these old books, they do their best to practice from them. These old treatises, they do their best, and then they slowly build upon what they know, and then they make a new viable form of sword combat out of it, based off of old stuff. And not once do they lie to themselves and go, this is the old art that's practiced all, years and years ago. These are the grandmasters did this. You're using an unbroken line of sword combat that existed. And I was like, well, we're reconstructing this as best as we can. And I think we got it pretty close. I'm pretty sure we got this pretty close, but we're continuing to research it, and we're continuing to build on it, and we're continuing to make it more and more viable. They're realistic about what they're doing. They're not lying to themselves. And that's why I personally hold them a little bit more highly than the traditionalist who's going to rag on them talking about, we have this unbroken line. Because you're lying to yourself if you're saying that. And these guys haven't been bullshitting anyone since they got started. And they're not lying to themselves either. That's something to keep in mind. Enough of that. Catch you guys later.